Good morning, my name is Juszczak and I will be interviewing Professor Mark Juszczak, a visiting faculty at APS in Warsaw. Today we'll be discussing the topic of calculating return on investment in education. A very interesting and exciting topic.
Thank you. So this is also a very, I think, controversial topic for lots of reasons. And most of them deal with the fact that it's very difficult to calculate the return on investment for something where you have a vague outcome in the future.
Yeah, so this actually leads me to my first question, which is why do we need to know how to calculate return on investment in education? Isn't education a public right? On one hand side, we have that financial term, return on investment, and on the other hand side, we have education as a public right. So how do these two concepts fit together?
Well, if we look at we're going to look at two models here. The American model and the European model of education at the primary and secondary level. So grade school and high school. In both cases, education is considered a right. So not only do you have the right to go, you actually have to go. Whether you want to or not, when you're in high school, you have to go to high school. When it comes to university and how universities are funded, there are big differences. With the US placing an emphasis to a very high extent on private higher education, Europe focusing more on public higher education. In both cases, though, I think that the fundamental question of is education a public good is one that both parts of the world grapple with, as does the whole world. And the reason is very simple. Right? I think it always helps to reduce things to their simplest elements possible. And we can pose the question, let's assume that we have an incredibly simple and small society. And in that small society, you need a baker, you need someone who knows how to grow wheat, and you need someone who knows how to deal with metal, a blacksmith. Right? And you pose the question, should the baker pay for the education of the future blacksmith's employee? And if you ask that question that way, we suddenly expose the entire internal mechanism of education as a public good in the first place and the debate about it. Because to say that it is a public good is to suggest that there are some in society who should disproportionately pay for the skills that others acquire. And this is an interesting question, actually. And I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm simply observing that this is the fundamental mechanism. Because if we reduce it to a very simple state, right? This case of the society where you have the baker, the blacksmith, and the farmer. Right? The way it used to work in medieval times was that the baker basically had an apprentice, or the blacksmith had an apprentice, and the apprentice paid for the education through an indentured period of 7 years, where basically that apprentice received room and board, but no real income. And we can look at this transaction and say, okay, basically what happened is that the apprentice paid for the education.
If I may interject,
Please.
This is the same as internship, basically.
Right.
So the apprentice was de facto, being in an internship with the master.
Absolutely. And we can ask the question right at that point, if education at any level exists, does it only exist as a large form of internships, or does it have some other intrinsic value that's not related to the job market that we're also taking into account as society? And that's a fascinating question, because that affects the whole issue of how we look at things like return on investment, right?
Yeah, here I think that we're talking several concepts at once, or at least that's how it seems to me, because I personally make a difference between public education at schools and internships. So these are two concepts that if we view separately, right now, as I understand it, we're discussing the public school portion of the concept.
Right, but to a certain extent, education, whether it's publicly funded or private education, if it only exists to make people ready for a job market, then it acts as the way an internship acted in an ancient time, because it serves the same ultimate purpose. And if it doesn't serve that purpose alone, then education might have some other incredibly valuable public good where the question of ROI becomes murkier. And this is where it gets interesting, right? So what if, for example, let's put this in that very simple context again about the blacksmith, the farmer, and the baker, right? What if, for example, by the blacksmith having an apprentice and the apprentice learning to be a blacksmith, the baker is better off for some other reason too?
Yeah, let's say that the baker would have better machinery that's made by the blacksmith due
Right.
to his or her education.
Right. And in this case, if the blacksmith can produce better machines in the future, right, the baker is better off. And suddenly you have the question of, is education solely something for personal benefit, which is this old model of education existing really only to drive you into a certain job, or does education have some other social good that is beyond the individual themselves? And the minute that we ask that question, how we calculate the return on investment becomes murky, but in a positive way. So to give you an interesting counterexample to this, if we look at the late 18th century in the United States, 1770 until 1790, the new American government, it was struggling with the question of what are the rights of citizens to primary education. And this is a fascinating question because at that time period, in that context, you have the world's only fully functioning democracy, posing the question, why should we as a society pay to educate our children? Because in theory, it could have happened otherwise. The government could have said, for example, well, it's better off for all of us if we leave it as a fully private market. If people want skills, they'll pay for them. If society needs skills, they'll be willing to pay for them in some way too. So the blacksmith will hire apprentices, the baker will hire apprentices, and in some way, the free market will work. But the government made a very deliberate choice. The choice it made was that education, in their view, was not specifically about job training. It was about citizenship. And the concept of the role of a citizen as an active agent in shaping his or her future and the future of those around them. And at that point, the question of ROI becomes fuzzy. How do we calculate the value of an informed citizen? How do we calculate the value of someone who understands how to contribute to a public marketplace of ideas? Maybe we can't, right? And I think this is why discussing the issue of how we calculate it is interesting in and of itself, because I'm willing to accept that there may be things of tremendous value that we can't calculate.
So, what are some methods to calculate the return on investment in education?
So let's look at this from two perspectives, right? One perspective, we have a very clear metric for return on investment, which is competencies acquired. Right? This is very simple, because here we can say, well, John is going to school. John will learn how to be an automotive repair technician in the school that he goes to for his degree in automotive repair skills, right? John will pay for that degree $10,000. And in 1 year, he'll be able to make an additional $20,000 a year, because he will now be hireable as an automotive technician instead of simply someone who works at a car wash. So we can very easily say the value of that education is the increase in income that John acquires over the course of his working life minus the cost of the education itself.
So that would be his personal gain, however.
Right,
that
his
would
personal
be,
gain.
We are talking his perspective.
Right.
So,
and this is actually what happens.
right, but so then how would you compare the personal perspective to that public perspective of the public good?
This gets harder.
Yeah, and the other thing that follows, out of your explanation about the fuzziness of return on investment in education is it even necessary to think about that concept, given that it is very hard to measure and that citizenship is not a metric?
Well, let's make it even more interesting by adding in a third dimension, which completely obfuscates or completely skews most of the data on return on investment to education. And that other factor is socioeconomic status. So it turns out that whatever schools may try to do, however schools may try to make students contribute and have some type of social mobility, the largest factor that tends to impact the kind of job you get, the salary you make, is the socioeconomic status of your parents. And we can look at this and say, well, it looks like the system really just replicates aristocracy. That's what it looks like, right? If we look at this from a broad perspective, and we realize that for a lot of people, no matter how much schooling they get, they probably will not be able to make much more money than their parents, or have jobs vastly different than their parents. And we have two different forces. One is the force of aristocracy, one is the force of meritocracy. And we have to look at how these two forces are balanced and they're impacted by school systems. And a lot of studies have been done. And it turns out, interestingly enough, that, for example, in the United States, the top colleges are not the best return on investment. So this is interesting because it doesn't mean that graduates of top universities don't make more money over their lifetime. It means that if we discount, or if we account for statistically, their socioeconomic status and the higher cost of the better education they're receiving, the return on investment is lower than it is in state colleges.
Okay, I need one clarification here, and I think it's important to distinguish between, are we discussing this from the perspective of the student, or are we discussing this from the perspective of the public good, and how are these intertwined? Because if you're saying that there is a low return on investment in more expensive colleges and higher education institutions, which perspective are you using here?
So this is an excellent question, and I can't even begin to address the question of public good until we first look at the limitations to assessment of return on investment at the individual level. Because, to put it bluntly, right, top universities in the US aren't top universities because they're teaching universities. They're top universities because they're research universities. And therefore, to a certain extent, they're willing to sacrifice a slight dip in quality of the teaching experience for their students for much higher return on investment of their research, which is their real focus. Whereas state colleges and city colleges and public colleges across the United States tend to be more focused on teaching. And as a result, at the individual level, the return on investment is better. To put it in simple terms, no matter what your socioeconomic status is, you get more bang for your buck. You make more dollars after you finish the degree for every dollar you've spent than you do in a top private university. Now comes an interesting question, right? Which is the question of public good. So we can pose this question from two levels. The first level is the level of research. And this is, I think, a critical aspect of education that we need to factor into in looking at the broad question of return on investment. Because de facto, the research that is done in American universities probably contributes far more to the quality of life in a technologically driven society than any quality teaching experience does alone. And here, the issue of return on investment is very different. And what we've found, on average, is that a corporation, a society as a whole, has to invest at least 3 to 4% of its GDP in research and development to maintain and to continuously improve the quality of life of its citizens.
This sounds wonderful, but I see a contradiction. So at an individual level, there is a lower return on investment for the individual who decides to pursue a more expensive and let's say a degree in a more prestigious university.
So why do it?
So on one hand side, individually, you will be like, yes, why do it? But then on the other hand side, these are the people who are the movers of society. Let's put it under that broader umbrella.
Except that their movement ability largely comes from socioeconomic status, which they already have. And because they already have it, the school doesn't add it, but the school benefits from it. So the average Harvard graduate, for example, right, will always out-earn the average state college graduate on average. But the percentage of that ability to out-earn the state college student even entered Harvard. So Harvard cannot be the thing that adds that value because it's already there. And this is where the whole issue comes in about how we disambiguate return on investment from socioeconomic status. It seems easy to say that top universities produce top graduates, but you can pose the question, if they're admitting the richest and smartest people already, what do they really contribute? Which is a great question to ask, right? But if we go back, this issue I think that you keep drawing me back to of a public good for return on investment, it's a really interesting topic, actually. And governments around the world, to the extent that they are investing in education systematically, are looking at this issue. And one of the most fascinating places to look at this probably is the Middle East today. And in the Middle East today, we can see how the government thinks about education, how it evaluates ROI, return on investment, and what are the pros and cons of their methodology. And this is very interesting.
So why would you pick the Middle East, and how is that so clear there? Why that example?
It's clear because the extremes are more extreme there at this moment.
Can you explain
Absolutely.
more for our audience, please?
So in the Middle East, you have a disproportionate number of very, very young people. There's a large population bubble of young people, which is inverse to the European Union and the US, where we have an aging demographic on average. So the Middle East, specifically the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council, this is Saudi, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, right? These countries, they are trying to spend large amounts of money educating these young people. But you have two fascinating problems. One, they have very high unemployment. So you have a lot of young people who are very educated, who have the skills for jobs that don't exist.
Just a question, are we talking K-12 education, are we talking higher
The whole
education?
spectrum. They're paying for everything.
So, okay, so basically, if you were to guess a percentage, what's the percentage of people who have higher education in, let's say, in the Middle East and the GCC area?
If we're talking about nationals themselves, because within the GCC, there's a huge difference between how citizens are educated and treated and how migrant workers and their families are treated. Okay? So if we're talking only about the nationals themselves, the rates of going to college are probably about 40 to 50% of that population group, which is quite high in the world.
That would compare, how would that compare to, let's say, the United States or any other European country on average?
It compares, if we look at the GCC versus something called the OECD, which is the 30 most developed countries in the world, the average rates of going into college are about the same. In the US and Western Europe, rates are about 40%. So about 40% of high school students enroll in college. This rate is historically actually very high for the world as a whole and for the OECD in particular. But when we're talking about return on investment, what's fascinating about the GCC is that because the governments themselves are not democratic in the same way that the US and Western Europe are, the notion of a public good being related to an educated citizenry is not part of their calculation of ROI. And here it gets fascinating. Because you have, for example, here's a great example. In the United Arab Emirates, when they look at return on investment of education, the only metrics they use are what are called brick and mortar metrics. The number of students, the number of classrooms, the number of seats, number of computers, the number of teachers. Things like, for example, the long-term job prospects of students, the happiness of students, their feeling of contribution and participation in society, how they learn, methodologies and pedagogy are not part of their calculations. And these governments are looking at education in a strictly utilitarian, skill-based context. And they then have a different return on investment model.
So basically you're saying that they're just looking at metrics that are very static, not dynamic.
Very physical.
Very physical, and in that way, they will produce satisfactory results that do not represent an actual development, an actual sense of growth that the students are developing.
And this is, I'll give you an example, specifically in the case of Qatar or the Emirates, where this becomes very interesting from a perspective of the government's intentions versus what they actually can do. So the government, these governments are heavily invested in STEM education, in helping high school students be more successful in science, technology, and math degrees, with the intention that these students will then go and use that technology to make society better. But at the same time, these students cannot, in the classroom, ask so-called sensitive questions which directly affect their own society. You can't have an advancement in science and technology and a limitation on speech.
Yeah,
and
that could be a contradictory situation that is basically...
And it's problematic, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you look at this, we can see that there is no calculation of ROI as a public good. And this comes back to the question of what the US government was doing in the 1790s. 230 years ago, the US government was asking fundamental questions about the value of paying for education, where those questions were not linked to skills or competencies, which is really interesting. And we can ask the question, why did it happen at that time, at that place? What was it? Because American democracy was so young, it was so vulnerable, it could have collapsed. But there was something else that happened along the way that we haven't talked about yet, which was equally important in their understanding of the public value of education as a whole. And what happened was this. When the US Constitutional Convention was held to form the US Constitution, the success of that Constitution was not the result directly of the convention in Philadelphia to create it. Because that convention, I'll put this to you in perspective, right? That convention took 3 to 4 months to form a document that was 4 pages long. The US Constitution is a very short document, but its success did not come from the debate of 50 people. Its success came because it took some time after they agreed to it for all the states back home to ratify it. And that process of ratification was contingent on one thing alone: newspapers. Newspaper readership was incredibly high in the US colonies. And the newspapers carried the debates about distribution of power in the Constitution to virtually every hamlet and every farm. And there was a recognition at that time period of the significance of literacy and understanding as a critical factor in public good.
Yeah, so that's a great example in exactly how education works as a public good.
Absolutely.
However, you brought these two concepts that were discussed, that paying in education and outcomes and skills were not related. Can you just explain that?
What do you mean that they're not related?
That's what you just mentioned before you started with the example about American Constitution. You just introduced that situation as a part of American history, where the question of paying for education and what skills were produced by that education were not related.
Right.
It wasn't clear what you meant by that. And
so what I mean by that is that here's an example of where a government or an organization, let's say, is willing to pay for something where the outcome of that something is uncertain, not linked to a person's specific job marketable skills, but is in the interest of all to have. And that thing was literacy,
right,
which could only be achieved through primary education. And what we see consistently in the world is that literacy doesn't just mean functional literacy, like I can read road signs. It means that I read generally, I read widely, right? And what we've discovered is that there's a very significant relationship between this functional day-to-day literacy and the evolution of a society. It's evolution of morality, it's evolution of technology, it's evolution of its own being. And we understand this implicitly. I don't think we're trying to create a metric for it. I don't think any government out there will come in and tell you that the public return on investment in education is X dollars. But they know that if they don't have it, that the results will be catastrophic.